Welcome to the New York Academy of Medicine's 2025 Bibliography Week lecture, Damned Lungs, Plague, and the Limits of Community in Early Modern England. I'm Arlene Shaner, the Historical Collections Librarian here at NIAM, and I want to take just a moment to tell those of you who are not familiar with us a little bit about who we are. So next slide, please. NIAM was founded in 1847 and has grown from its beginnings as a membership organization for regular physicians into a much more expansive organization that continues to provide opportunities for our fellows, who now come from a wide range of healthcare professions, to engage with each other, but also a policy organization that is currently devoted to addressing health in every phase of life to build health span, ensuring that all people have what they need, not only for longer, but also for healthier lives. Our library, which dates back to the founding of NIAM itself, has been open to the public since 1878, and we were then, and continue to be, the only medical library in New York City that anyone can use. We have one of the most significant history of medicine and public health collections in the country, if not the world. And the reading room accommodates a steady stream of researchers, classes, and tours. There are many ways to connect with us if you can't visit in person, through things like our digital collections, events, newsletters, and virtual visits. Let's turn our attention now to some housekeeping issues. While our speaker is presenting, attendees will be muted with their cameras off. Please do drop any questions that you have for our speaker into the chat. Once the talk is over, I'll be sharing your questions with her, and she will answer as many of them as she can before the end of the event. It's now my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Shirlon, Associate Professor of English at Syracuse University. Dr. Shirlon was born in Montreal to non-English speaking parents whose families migrated to Canada by way of Latin America and Western Europe just before and after World War II. This history of migration imprinted on the subjects of her research and the institutional and disciplinary travels through which she pursued them. Her training in theater performance, classical rabbinic literature, and post-colonial trauma and Holocaust studies forged her critical engagements with the Western canon, from the great books curriculum of her undergraduate major to the ongoing work of reckoning with the Renaissance and its historical inclusions, exclusions, inheritances, and legacies. Dr. Shirlon completed degrees at the University of British Columbia, and the Liberal Arts College of Concordia University in Montreal, before receiving her PhD from Brandeis University in 2009. She teaches and publishes on a wide range of topics, including early modern science and medicine, drama and performance, ecology, religion, travel, and empire. Her first book, Robert Burton and the Transformative Powers of Melancholy, Routledge 2016, intervened in the historiography of early modern melancholy by challenging its readings and uses of Burton's important work. She is currently working on a series of articles on hidden and/or forgotten histories of respiratory medicine. She's also completing a book tentatively titled The Breathing World, A History of Air in Shakespeare, which engages with environmental, performance, and disability studies, respiratory, atmospheric, and speculative philosophy, sensory studies, especially sound, critical human geography, religious history, and critical race and ethnic studies to investigate the ecological, psychological, spiritual, and political implications of air for Shakespeare's audiences, and to show how the erasure of such implications constitutes a prominent theme in his work. Dr. Shirlon is an active member of the Global Pre-Modern Studies and Jewish Studies programs at Syracuse University and is co-director of the Mellon-funded Central New York Humanities Corridor Working Group on practice-based performance studies. She's been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including from the Folger and Huntington Libraries, and she was a year-long fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies as a member of Sensing the Truth, Changing Conceptions of the Perceptual in Early Modern and Enlightenment Europe. I first had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Shirlon when she spent part of the summer of 2023 doing research in the NIAM library, some of which she will be speaking about this evening. When Dr. Shirlon arrived at the library 2 summers ago, I don't think either of us expected that she would find such a rich array of sources in the library's collections. Her talk tonight will bring to light the many ways in which cross-disciplinary sources may be used to generate new analyses for the history of medicine and show how they help her trace a history of stigma surrounding respiratory illness to a conflation of breath and grace after the Reformation that renders respiratory ease a hallmark of social and economic status, and labored breathing a sign of spiritual defect or despair. Through an examination of such diverse sources as medical practica, works of spiritual counsel, salves and preparations for sickness and death, plague orders and proclamations, special forms of prayer to be said in times of pestilence, and an unpublished manuscript from our collection, the compendious table of the pestilence or the plague, she will help distill and visualize the complexity of early modern spiritual material plague theory across multiple genres. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherilyn. I am now going to ask her to share her screen with us, but before she starts to speak, I would like to end by mentioning that this lecture was partly supported with funding from the Liliana Sauter Lecture Fund here at NIAN. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start my slide presentation and ensure that I'm sharing the correct screen. Share. Okay. I don't know if Arlene's able to give me a confirmation.
You are not sharing the correct screen.
Okay. All right, let me try that one more time. Share.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And we are seeing your notes.
Oh. All right, let me try that one more time. Share. Is that one giving you the correct one?
Yes.
Sans notes?
Yes, I think we're good.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. I'm not sure where everyone's joining from, but in much of the Northeast, it's anyway, in the Midwest, it's very, very cold. I'm so grateful to the New York Academy of Medicine, to Reggie Joseph, and the incomparable Arlene Shaner, whose passion for her work and the work of the library is in every way responsible for my talk tonight. I've been working for some 8 years now on a book that pursues a thesis hinted at in my talk's abstract, part of which you heard Arlene read from again this evening. And it goes like this: predestination, the doctrine that some of us are saved and some damned, and there's nothing we can do about it, facilitates the conflation of breath and grace after the Reformation. Salvation is not merited by good deeds such as charity or prayer. It is a gift. For Calvin, whose teachings were central to the Church of England under both Elizabeth and James, faith itself is a gift unequally bestowed by God upon the elect. He says, the better to display his liberality, God does not bestow it upon all promiscuously, but by special privilege imparts it to whom he will. Calvin quotes Augustine, who writes that our, quote, Savior, to teach that faith in him is a gift, says, no man can come to me except the Father draw him. My research explores the early modern experience of being drawn to and drawing in faith as breath, literally inspiration, and the absence of faith, despair, as breathlessness. In the wake of protests against respiratory injustice that have become the mantra of Black Lives Matter, my project considers the unequal distribution of grace as a religious template onto which the unequal distribution of respiratory privilege and precarity has been mapped and legitimated. The focus of my talk tonight will be to show how plague both sharpened and exposed the arbitrariness of these distinctions, belied as they were and are by the radical dependency upon and enmeshment of all creaturely life with air. With Worlds Enough in Time, I would show you a sampling of many, many more kinds of materials in which set enmeshment is pervasive. Here's just a few, and we're going to be returning to Ambrose Paré in a little bit. But these are, as most of the materials that I'm going to be talking about tonight, examples taken from the Niam collections. We have Wingfield's A Compendious Short Treatise. And you hear these kinds of sentiments. Of all things, air is chiefly to be observed amongst the concerns for medica practica. The chapter of my book that pursues this argument that I just outlined for you, about the plague anyway, didn't start that way. The first version, penned in the aftershock of Brexit and the 2016 presidential election, attempted to read the filth and foggy air of Macbeth and the rise of tyranny it gives cover to as an effect of cultivated disaffection, anesthetic witness, and delayed or failed responsiveness to the suffering of others. The pivotal scene for me then, and still is, this one. In Act 4, the hero Macduff bemoans the fate of Scotland to Malcolm, the rightful heir to the throne, who has fled to England and whose help he seeks to overthrow. To overthrow Macbeth. Malcolm seems in no rush to return, even as Macduff laments that, quote, each new morn, new widow's howl, new orphan's cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face, that it resounds as if it felt with Scotland and yelled out like syllable of dolor. Malcolm says he'll reserve his tears and actions for that which he may be sure of, pinning his doubt on his suspicion of Macduff, who has somehow escaped Scotland alive and left his family behind. Who but a traitor would do such a thing? Later that same scene, the messenger Ross arrives with news from Scotland, where nothing, but who knows nothing, is once seen to smile, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rent the air are made, not marked. The dead man's knell is there scarce asked for, and good men's lives expire before the flowers in their caps, dying, or ere they sicken. These last lines have long been taken to evoke the plague as metaphor. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the play necessarily takes place during plague outbreak per se, but that plague and the conditioning of response to it give rise to the play's crises. Malcolm's question of the messenger, what's the newest grief, sounds hollow from the safety of his long exile. And in some of the chronicles that the play is based upon, that exile seems to last for as long as 10 years, even though the play makes it seem like it takes place in the matter of hours. Macduff asks about his wife and children, and Ross tells him first that they are well and quote unquote at peace. You should read his code, but he doesn't. Only after he secures the king's military support does Ross admit that he has words that would be, quote, howled out in the desert air where hearing should not latch them. Macduff asks whether these concern the, quote, general cause or belong to some single breast. Ross rejects the distinction. He says, no mind that's honest, but in it shares some woe, conceding nonetheless that the main part pertains to Macduff alone. The news, not news to us, is that Macduff's wife and children have been slaughtered. The audience witnesses their murder in the preceding scene, but not before we hear Lady Macduff complain to Ross of her husband's abandonment. She says he, quote, wants the natural touch to flee and leave his family. A messenger follows Ross's own hasty departure, warning, quote, be not found here, and hence with your little ones. Heaven preserve you. I dare not abide longer. I dare abide no longer. To this, Lady Macduff, child at her side, replies, whither should I fly? A question that, as if to prove the play's own point, may have required our own pandemic or our own familiarity with pandemic to hear as follows. In times of pestilence, who could fly and who was left behind to die? In the summer of 2023, as Arlene mentioned, I made my first visit to Niam to examine a variety of materials of the kind I have been surveying for my research on early modern breathing: receipt books, recipe books, herbals and pharmacopoeia, medical treatises, advice books, plague orders and proclamations, special forms of prayer to be said in times of plague and of thanksgiving having been delivered from them. I looked, at Arlene's encouragement, at midwifery and obstetric manuals for guidance on respiratory illness in infancy, and at the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying well, with its scripts for the performance of good Christian death that culminates in the taking, or rather returning to God, of the last breath. I was particularly interested in manuscript notes that might shed light on the startling absence of archival witness to the experience of respiratory difficulty. An absence or silence I have come to attribute to the stigma of respiratory qua spiritual disease. I'd begun my survey of such materials in England a few summers before the pandemic, and secured a small grant to conduct similar research at North American libraries in 2020. I resumed that survey at the Huntington First when they reopened in June of 21. Masked and spectacled, I was constantly aware of the breath that seeped up and out from under my mask and into my glasses, fogging my view. It was through such clouding, that I recognized the familiarity of what had once seemed impossibly archaic. The fog of uncertainty over hygiene, ever-changing rules for isolation, quarantine, social distancing, healthcare, and social relief. This image, which I had in the first slide, being from Thomas Decker's A Rod for One-Ways, not in the collections at NIAM, but excruciatingly vivid in its depiction of the theme I'm exploring. These lenses, these fogged lenses, are the ones I took with me to NIAM, even when I was no longer wearing a mask. On my first day, I encountered this very unusual text, never to my knowledge printed, and about which I have been able to find nothing written. Its medical advice is more or less standard for the period, with some quiddities that may have to do with the selection of the, quote, latest and best physicians that it claims to draw upon in its title. The synoptic table convention that it uses is ubiquitous in early modern print as a visual aid, but unusual in the absence of the prose contents that it more typically organizes. As is nearly universally attested to in the period, the superior cause of plague is God's anger. You can see that up here. The influence of stars or sideration, not highlighted, is inferior, as is the highlighted infective and poisonous air. But this represents the first sphere of human exercise, the first sphere humans exercise any real control over, and as such occupies the primary place in practical considerations of plague and its management. The tables summarize plague theory in a highly condensed style of language whose imagery and arrangements sounded uncannily familiar to me, as in the chiasmus, we have it here, misty tempests and tempestuous mists, which call to mind Macbeth's fair is foul and foul is fair, and the alliterative echo of fat and foggy fens in the play's fog and filthy air. The eerie familiarity extends to the play's plot and theme. The table's causes of infective air that you see here outlined make up a kind of witch's brew, as it were, of malefaction and tempest, boggy, fenny, filthy air, and the primal corruption, moral and physical, of the unburied dead. I'll remind that the play begins with the so-called good King Duncan suppressing revolt on multiple fronts and holding the unburied corpses of the rebel armies for ransom. The first and foremost of preservative remedies in these tables is to call upon God with true and sincere repentance, followed by the advice, also ubiquitous and frequently at odds with the former, to fly from it speedily, far off, and not to return in haste. You see those highlighted. Philip Barrow, for instance, in The Method of Physic, first published in 1583, of which NIAM owns a rather extraordinary 1617 copy bound for the king that we can look at, as well as other materials at the end of the talk during discussion. Barrow offers this typical prescription. There cannot be a more present remedy to preserve one than flying from the corrupt air, and you must fly far off into such a place whereas the air is known to be pure and good and destitute of corruption. Neither must you return home again very soon. Hereupon it is not rashly said, these three adverbs, cito, longe, et tarde, quickly, far, and slowly, that is slowly to come back. Therefore, they that may conveniently for their business fly away, let them not be persuaded by any means to tarry, which if they do, they shall foolishly put themselves in danger of pestilent death. But back to the tables. whose visual hierarchy suggests that resistance, you can see that here on the right-hand column, to resist the plague, is a last resort for those unable to leave for reasons of necessity, duty, or what the tables call game, business, such as merchants and traffickers. To them remains the preservatives of, quote, hindering the air agent, and strengthening the body. The former makes a distinction between the air public or general and the air private or domestical in terms that are somewhat unique for the period. The common air is much more typical of formulation. The public air is purged by burning woods and groves adjacent to towns and cities, cleaning the streets and erecting bonfires. That's the origin of where we get the term bonfire. Bonfires of sweet and fragrant wood and herbs in them, preventing assemblies, especially of wantons, we'll get back to that, and killing all cats and dogs to be disposed elsewhere. The domestic air is purged by optimizing the flow of directional winds, the removal of all filth and sluttishness, taking the air abroad only in fair weather and hours. Note that the domestic air in this way extends beyond the domus. With perfuming and fumigation, and with the avoidance of immediate respiratory contact, quote, meeting none mouth to mouth, but declining aside. The means to strengthen the patient assume privileges that would not have been widespread. Good and plentiful clothing, appropriate to the season and frequently changed. Labor, moderate, not violent, and only in the morning. Massage. Diet, which we'll see elaborated on the next page. Much sleep. The recommended diet is replete with luxury items, breads made with flour sown before the plague and baked with clear wood, eggs, mutton, veal, rabbit, pullet, capon and cockerel, sea and freshwater fish such as roasted sole, trout, and salmon, fresh fruits, sweet and sharp, only lastly more common herbs and root vegetables. The foods to be avoided are those that the poor would have had greater access to legally or otherwise: goat milk, wild meats, sodden pork, powdered beef, and cacochemical or fluid preserves such as blood pudding. While gluttony and surfeiting are discouraged, this table clearly follows the general medical wisdom that full bellies are more resilient to plague than empty ones. In fact, this is one of the explanation Ambrose Paré gives for the customary keeping of plague goats. The first reason accords with the principle of contraria contrariis curuntur, driving out one thing, in this case one poison, as it were, with another. The strong scent which the goat sends forth prohibits entrance of the venomous air, he says. He elaborates on this principle with a series of striking associations. Besides, he adds, it argues that such as are hungry are apter to take the plague than those who have eaten moderately, for the body is not only strengthened with meat, but all the passages are filled by the vapors diffused from thence, by which otherwise the infected air would find a more easy entrance to the heart. The common thought that, quote, one ill scent drives away another calls to mind for him the Scythian physician who stopped a plague by killing the cats and dogs and beasts and leaving their carcasses in the streets, that, quote, so by the coming of this new putrid vapor, as a stranger, the former pestiferous infection, as an old guest, was put out of its lodging. I'm struck by the language here of host and guest, stranger and lodging, and the disposability of a household's most liminal creatures, whose death and decay creates a kind of controlled backburn to fight, as it were, familiar with foreign poison or fire. In early modernity, the familial household becomes the arbitrary unit of the familiar. In plague literature, we see this logic repeatedly upset by the interdependence and competition for survival between such units and their members. The half-starved goat sacrificed to protect the household provides a haunting parallel by which to understand the logic of group and individual preservation in period plague management and its legacies of what we have called essential and therefore disposable labor and laborers. Following the 1636 outbreak of plague in London and Westminster, the King's printer published a collection of earlier acts and orders for plague management under the title Certain Necessary Directions as well for the cure of the plague as for preventing infection. The volume presents its contents as royal precedents for the taking of harsh measures to both punish and provide for the vulnerable in times of pestilence. The book is addressed to the justices of the peace tasked with implementing and upholding these measures that alternate between appeals to reason and charity, benevolence and threat. The directions anticipate the non-compliance of the rich as much as the poor. No man shall depart his house except it to be to a house not inhabited and of such distance that he may conveniently travel without lying by the way. No staying at inns or with friends, that is. Flight is only approved for those with second homes, and perhaps a series of them. The advice of the physicians cautions against the flight of those who are wont to spread infection without even showing signs of it. To prevent this, those fleeing are required to obtain certificates, literally pre-flight tests, before doing so. The classed experience of plague, which purportedly knew no such distinctions, is anticipated throughout the unnecessary directions. For instance, because the quote, better sort are unlikely to call on plague doctors, excuse me. Those they do call upon are required to notify the overseers with the ambiguous and relatively soft-handed suggestion that care may be, quote, had thereof by the physicians deputed. Another consistent class marker in the directions, as well as the broader literature of dispensary in the period, is the differentiation between recommendations for the masses and preservatives for the, what you see there, richer sort. Excuse me. The preface to the reprinted 1603 orders in this volume explains its strategy for recycling these earlier texts. As the most loving and gracious care of his majesty for the preservation of his people hath already been showed and declared by such means and ways as were thought expedient to suppress the grievous infection, it is likewise his gracious pleasure that the same be carefully provided and put in practice. These orders lay out the primary tactics of identification, taxation, and containment. Mapping, quote, what towns and villages are infected is done to determine who may be taxed to support the relief and restraint of the poor. The boundaries of such obligation are drawn along lines of geographic adjacency and economic interdependence, while the arbitrary of divisions between shires and counties separated, quote unquote, only by name is exposed. Scholars have written at length about the harshness of lockdown procedures. That should mean early modern lockdown procedures that make COVID measures seem gentle by comparison. In the 1603 directions, survivors of the plague are to be closed up in their houses for 6 weeks after sickness has departed, after sickness has ceased in the domicile. If the infection is dispersed through the village and those responsible for serving cattle or manuring feeds must exit their homes to do so, they're forbidden from, quote, resorting into the company of others and must wear a mask and wear a mark in their uppermost garments or bear white rods. And if there's any doubt that any masters or owners of houses infected will not, quote, observe this shutting up of doors, elsewhere we read this includes windows, watchmen are deployed to stand and guard and apprehend anyone who tries to come out. Here we have a couple of other elaborations of some such harsher measures. Any person come from a place infected to any other place, the parish from whence they come, shall at their charge cause the party so visited and escaped to be carried and brought back again by night and punished, and the house of the receiver of such visited person to be shut up for 20 days. And what might be more recognizable, especially from that first image, every house visited to be marked with a red cross a foot long in the middle of the door, and with these usual printed words say, Lord, have mercy upon us. The orders subtly acknowledge their limited help, where they point to their charitableness in printing advice for the quote unquote meaner sorts and those who cannot be reached by physicians. But the language of charity is repeatedly eschewed in favor of the logic of public health. as when magistrates are enjoined to fund the replacement of possessions to be burnt in order to prevent spread and reinfection. The relative softness of such appeals is, however, contrasted by the threat of punishment of the poor by imprisonment and other non-specified notorious sharp example. The stick is brandished to prevent not only disobedience, but critique, especially by those who protest that these rules are unchristian. I'll just read a little bit from that section here before I go on. It reads, if there be any person ecclesiastical or lay that shall hold and publish any opinions that it is a vain thing to forbear to resort to the infected, or that it is not charitable to forbid the same, pretending that no person shall die, but at their time prefixed, such persons shall be not only reprehended, but by order of the bishop, if ecclesiastical, shall be forbidden to preach, and being lay shall be enjoined to forbear, to utter such dangerous opinions upon pain of imprisonment. And yet it shall appear manifestly by these orders that, according to Christian charity, no person of the meanest degree shall be left without succor and relief. Such charges, as the ones I just read, would likely have arisen in response to the plague laws against the provision of charity and hospitality. Parishes were tasked both with keeping foreigners out and keeping their own within. In the name of public hygiene, quote, rogues and wandering beggars are not to be suffered in the streets in any manner whatsoever. The necessary directions includes a proclamation for quickening the laws made for the relief of the poor, and the suppressing, punishing, and settling of the sturdy rogues and vagabonds. These laws, to be quickened, refer to the Elizabethan anti-vagrancy laws, first laid out in the 1572 Vagabond Act and expanded in subsequent orders such as the 1597 and 1601 Poor Relief Acts. The compilation of these texts in the necessary directions documents the rise of the English surveillance state and its biopolitical policing powers under the protracted and repeated emergencies of plague. The orders emphasize the importance of distinguishing the quote-unquote truly poor from pretenders. I'm reading here. Our cities of London and Westminster and suburbs thereof and places adjacent and generally throughout the whole kingdom are commanded to set careful watch for the apprehending and publishing of all rogues and vagabonds who go under the names of soldiers or mariners, glassmen, potmen, peddlers, or petty chapmen, or of poor or impotent people. Great care is to be taken that, quote, none pass under the color of counterfeit passes, and that all Irish rogues and vagabonds be forthwith apprehended wheresoever they shall be found, and punished and sent home. We'll get to that in a minute. All householders at whose houses such vagrants appear are to cause them to be apprehended and carried to the next constable or other officer to be punished. They are to forbear to relieve them, lest that give encouragement to continue in their wicked course of life. None may pretend ignorance of these laws, and whoever shall be found remiss or ignorant shall receive such punishment as by the laws of this realm or by our prerogative royal can or may be inflicted. The 1601 Act for the Relief of the Poor follows in this compilation with its mandate for forced conscription of children of the poor to work and apprenticeship, even up to the ages of 24. It imposes strict limits on the kinds of dwellings that can be built for the poor and the number of quote-unquote inmates or families that can inhabit them, no more than one family to a house or cottage. We see how the heteropatriarchal family is tasked in isolation with responsibility for the welfare, indeed the survival of its members. A similarly nuclear fantasy of origins may be seen in the continuance for the statute of rogues that brutally extends the punitive reach of the Elizabethan vagrancy laws. In order to prevent the absorption of vagrants into, quote, some other parts of the realm, those apprehended are to be branded with the letter R for rogue, and thereupon be sent to the place of his dwelling, if he have any. If not, then to the place where he last dwelt, by the space of a year. If that can be known by his confession or otherwise, and if that cannot be known, then to the place of his birth, there to be placed in labor as a true subject ought to do. Finally, after such punishments, if any shall offend again in begging or wandering, the party shall be judged a felon. Felony was also the charge laid upon those who, quote, willfully and contemptuously go abroad and converse in company, having any infections during pestilence. And a punishment for such offense in the 1603 Act was death. In my remaining minutes, I want to turn to another form of plague writing, special forms of prayer to be said during times of pestilence. As I mentioned earlier, there are also special forms for thanksgiving upon delivery from such dangers. The urgency that compels these supplemental prayers makes them fascinating and often wrenching testimonies to the cultural performance of loss, grief, and powerlessness in plague. As with the other materials I study, I typically examine these forms for evidence of use, reader marks and annotations, supplements to the supplement, as it were, such as this one in a copy held at Christ Church Library in Oxford, in which the reader has added the priestly blessing. As printed texts, these forms are variations upon standard services prescribed in the Book of Common Prayer. The confession in the 1626 form at the NIAM is the same as the general confession added to the 1552 edition. Almighty and most merciful Father, we have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. We have followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. We have offended against thy holy laws. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done, and there is no health in us. The gentlewoman observing the sleepwalking Lady Macbeth detachedly remarks that she has, quote, spoken what she should not, and echoes Malcolm's indifference to what he is ignorant of. Heaven knows what she has known. Unlike Macduff's imagining at a distance of the sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air, the audience and stage auditors hear the lady emit a sound so terrible it prompts the gentlewoman to remark that she would not have such a heart in her bosom for the dignity of the whole body. The same sound leads the doctor to conclude that her disease is beyond his practice. Lady Macbeth seems to hear something, however, that we don't. A knocking at the gate that evokes the clamor of the storm that the porter personifies as the wretched lot of humanity seeking sanctuary. Perhaps in her own wretched state, the lady hears and responds to those cries for help. Come, come, come. Give me your hand, she says. Oh, sorry. What's done cannot be undone. Lest I conclude on a note too bleak or seemingly despairing, I'll offer an alternative by way of a comment about the function of echoes like this one, in Shakespeare and early modern poetic practice more generally. What might seem the empty repetition of hollow sound is often the most resonant form of witness to what no one but the air seems to hear. The lady hears the knocking at the gate and extends her hand. Too late for her, but maybe not for us. That's the end of my slide presentation per se. I have a number of slides, lots of materials that I didn't have a chance to fit into the narrative portion, others that I'd be delighted to share depending on the interest that comes up in the questions. I know I've taken us through somewhat of a condensed argument and somewhat of a condensed illustration of how I'm articulating that argument around the kinds of sources I was working with at NIAM. So I will turn back to Arlene and stop screen share for now. Or no, I think I'll leave it in screen share so that I can toggle to different slides, but I will invite Arlene to resume moderating.
So I hope everyone will join me in thanking Stephanie Sherlon for her presentation. Please put your questions in the chat. So right now there are no questions in the chat, although there's the invitation to put questions in the chat. And I do hope that people will add questions. So I am going to do my best to start us off here. So, one of the things that we talked about a lot when you were using our collections and that you talked about to some extent tonight was the variety of sources that all kind of focus on similar kinds of issues, from the very medical, some of which you shared, to the very non-medical, all of these other kinds of appeals that are located within the collections. So it is no surprise to see these kinds of texts in not just, out there in the world, but in our collections. All of these different sorts of guides for right living, for right dying, for the ways in which you can approach these challenges. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of the more close association of these very prescriptive medical works with these very prescriptive, more kind of religious and philosophical works.
Sure, yeah. I'm tempted to go back. I'm trying to think which of the slides I've shown. Maybe
All right, you can just answer.
I will, but I'm not screen sharing anymore.
No.
I'll screen share. It was this one, share. That's the one without my notes, right? I mean, not that I'm hiding my notes necessarily. I wanted to go back and show the tables, which one of the things I found so striking about them was the vividness of their representation, their literal visualization of, I think, the phenomenon that you're describing, Arlene, and that I would gloss as follows. For those of us who work in, I mean, my first book was on melancholy, and for those of us who work on the history of affect or um, any kinds of medical experience that have largely been the province of what we think of as the mental health care professions in the modern age, really require those of us who work in the early modern period a reminder that I'm going to use that word I started with, the enmeshment of the material and the physical and the spiritual world is the first axiom for how physicians understood health and disease. Such that on the one hand, the plague is clearly caused first and foremost by God's anger, but that God's anger as a superior cause leads to or is demonstrated as enacted as a punishment for sins, for human sins. And in this interesting welter of the confusion of cause and effect, do human sins produce the noxiousness of the atmosphere? We see that a lot in the text, the suggestion that vice and moral pollution actually contaminates in a physical, material way one's environs. So gaming and prostitution and so forth, as well as industry, which gets really complicated depending on who's complaining about industrial pollution or not. But that's part of the answer, is that this is a world in which the spiritual and the physical are absolutely intertwined. And people like Robert Burton, who I wrote my first book on, we're trained as divines, doctors of divinity, who are offering what genres of medical care that we don't use these terms anymore, but things like spiritual hygiene, moral hygiene, I don't know if that's useful.
Yeah. So we do have some comments and questions in the chat now. And the
Okay.
first comment is from Judith. And she says, oh, I have to go up here. Wonderful talk. I don't have questions yet, but I want to say that I wish I'd heard this talk last term when I taught an honors grad student seminar on early modern plague literature. She will have a question later. But
Okay.
so the first question then is from Jim Watts, who says, I think I understood you to say that the medical sources do not mention breathing difficulty very much. Can you discuss that more and why you think they avoided talking about respiratory problems?
Okay. Thanks, Jim. So the medical literature does, in a somewhat abstract way. When I was saying that there's a gap, it's in the representation, what we might think of as clinical notes or presentation notes or descriptions where I most expected to see these in kind of diaristic literature, firsthand, first person witness accounts of difficult last breaths in particular. And the more I looked in the archives, I didn't see an awful lot of description or representation of difficult breathing, even outside of the deathbed. After now doing this work in archives for the last 8 years or so, I feel like I can confidently say, one of the librarians I consulted with at one point when I said, I think this is because of the stigma against difficult breathing in death in particular. And in a different chapter of the book, I work at length with Calvin, who both tries to distinguish the animal breath from God's, or the animals and the breath that makes us alive from God's animating breath, with some really inconsistent and great trouble, partly because at the same time, the tradition of imitatio Dei and a death that imitates Christ is prescribed as one that, as I mentioned, peacefully, willingly yields up and returns the ghost. The struggle, the representation of a dying breath as one that is gasping and groaning and panting for life. My argument is that after the Reformation, that designates some for salvation and some for reprobation, that there's a kind of, the word in history of religion is soteriological. There's a kind of a diagnostic that takes place of that performance as, is that a likely sign of grace, or is that a likely sign of damnation? You can imagine the stress that this put people under, to have to prepare for a death where they could be in control of how they behave in extremis that way. One of the things that I was looking at Nyan that I didn't include in my slides here is a bit from Perkins's salve. This is one of the salves where actually, of all people, Perkins tells us, don't worry too much about it. The manner of our living matter is more of the diagnostic and the soteriology of the manner of our death. And you can almost, Perkins, who worried so much about all aspects of how one performs, the likelihood of one's grace, cuts us a little bit of slack on the deathbed, which was something of a surprise.
So the next question, again, so Judith now saying, I do have a question. In talking about the plague orders, you suggest that the punitive measures counterbalance the emphasis on charity. Did you find that the different iterations of these plague orders in successive outbreaks shift the emphasis to one or the other?
It's a really good question. And this compilation, The Necessary Directions in 1636, isn't totally comprehensive. One of the slides that I saved for the end that I didn't show, and here, let me see if I can go ahead to it. It'll give us a chance to see some other things. And actually, while I do that, to show something in reference to Jim's question. Oh, here, while I have this up, a little bit of a tour. So some of the other materials that I was looking at, and a demonstration of, the range of the kinds of sources, but it's also the range within the sources. One of my complaints, and one of the reasons that I've set about doing this project, is because the history of respiratory medicine, I would argue, remains largely underwritten. And the orthodoxy in medical historiography is to say that there really isn't much change that happens until the end of the 17th, really the beginning of the 18th century, with the late 17th century books on asthma, on the discovery of oxygen and so forth. But that when you look at, among other things, these recipe books and these receipt collections, you find a great variety of terminology for respiratory experience, for respiratory anatomy, and a total plethora. I mean, people experience difficult breathing. We get language like straightness of wind, stiffness of the pipes. We get the chink cough or kink cough in children. Lots of language about coughs of the lungs, consumption, and the confusion and the intermingling of these terms across these recipe collections is really interesting. But I was going to find, the thing I was going to show Jim, and then I'll get back to Judith's question about variable punitiveness versus permissiveness of reward. In the copy of Barrow held at the NIAM, Bound for the King, really beautiful copy, you find two such pieces of evidence. One, an excellent medicine for the cough of the lungs that's been inscribed as a manuscript note in the front fly. And then in the back, and I'm not a paleographer. I submitted some images of the pestilential tables, the compendious tables, to a group of early modernists on Facebook, some of whom might be here tonight, asking for some help dating it, because that's one of the things I didn't get a chance to get into. It's a very strange, there's a lot of things about it that are strange that make its dating in the catalog, which Arlene has suggested may not be completely reliable. There's not a lot of information from its acquisition, but it's listed as an Elizabethan text. I think I'm getting a little bit more evidence to suggest that probably is true, at least in the original, even if this was a copy of the original pestilential tables. But nonetheless, what I wanted to address here, by saying I'm not a paleographer, is this really extraordinary and very rare mention of a person's own respiratory difficulty. And here's just a little taste of what I could transcribe. Sunday, the 23rd of October, I was coming up the stairs and coughed. Out of my lungs came the stone, fully whatever, yellow of color, etc., and so forth. So those are likely the notes of somebody who was a medical practitioner for the king, because this is the king's copy of Barrow, and doesn't have a year. But we have all this information sandwiched into the same copy, and I referred to this text earlier to give an example of the ubiquity of the direction to run, to flee. As for Judith's question about do we see notable, or how do we discern the pattern between more permissive and more punitive measures? I'm happy to direct people to, Kira Newman has a really good article about the 1636, I believe. In the years since 2020, there's been more research, unsurprisingly, on how the Elizabethan state in particular, why the Elizabethan state in particular, because it was belated. These kinds of measures were first introduced in Italy centuries earlier. They are only systematized in England under Elizabeth and James. And those who work in that area know the term that I was referring to: the rise of the absolutist state, the rise of the police state, the biopolitical powers of policing by the absolutist state. That I'm suggesting really need to be traced, particularly through plague literature, as my colleagues who work on things like the AIDS pandemic know. There's nothing new in the state issuing edicts of emergency that coincide with other prerogatives of the government to control and to discipline and survey its subjects. I see.
So I have another question. So it's from Kat L, who starts by saying, "Thank you for a wonderfully rich talk. My question concerns your turn near the end to the religious literature on plague. You make clear that the political and social discourses surrounding the division between the richer and poorer sort treat these socioeconomic disparities as a matter of course. Are the sermons and prayer books similarly fatalistic?
Mm-hmm.
And do they posit similar divisions between Christians and non-Christians?"
I love that the questions are giving me an opportunity to share some slides I didn't have a chance to look at. So
And you've got a bunch of questions now.
okay, very quickly, and I'm happy to share these sources with anybody who might be interested in them. But the short answer is the ecclesiastical responses are, as the necessary directions suggest, much, much more likely to be critical of the government than not. And you see a wide array of sermons literally written on, like Otto Werdmüller's A Most Fruitful and Learned Treatise, How a Christian Man Ought to Behave Himself in the Danger of Death. Basically, the question that Luther asks, whether a Christian man may flee the plague. He has a long letter that from which I quoted in a couple of little paragraphs here that I'm not going to have time to read through. But essentially, he says, I'm not going to fault people who do run, but if we do run, we should make sure that we're leaving care in our absence. And he really he equivocates. I mean, to use a word that's one of the key terms we've used to understand the crisis of Macbeth and the crisis of political equivocation. I'm going to suggest that plague presented a problem of equivocation over whether one did or didn't have the right and how one exercised the right for self-preservation and how that self was constituted and who it was attached to.
We have two more questions. The first one is, were there any sources you were surprised to find at NIAM?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the pestilential table, the compendious table for sure. I mean, that was really quite striking. I don't have images here lined up to show tonight because I'm focusing on NIAM. But I think some of the surprise that I tried to demonstrate in how, I mean, I've looked at these forms of prayer in many different places. I gave that instance of the one from Christ Church College that I found years ago. But reading the standard general confession in this copy at NIAM with these other texts arranged suddenly made me hear Lady Macduff's what's done cannot be undone completely anew. So I think I would answer that by saying it helped me to see the nature of the collection as a history of medicine collection, or that has such great riches in the history of medicine as a medical library, helped me to think about literary texts differently. So it's a bit of a cheat answer, but it's a true answer. And then, of course, the tables. I was really, I mean, I plan on going back. In some ways, it felt like I was there longer, but I think it was only about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So I have lots to go back and see, and I hope that my colleagues who work in the history of medicine or in other areas that butt onto histories of medicine will seriously take up my exhortation to make use of this amazing resource.
So we have two more questions here, and I think that will bring us right to the end of our time. The first is from Karen. Thank you for this breathtaking talk, if you'll forgive the pun. How did you find the amazing manuscript with the tables? Does the Ramist diagramming of its charts tell us something about the author's education? See Walter Ong on Petrus Ramus. That exhausts the extent of my knowledge of Ramism.
So yeah, it is a very interesting document. As I said, the convention of the synoptic table is very I'm using this word a lot tonight. It's ubiquitous. It's all over the period printed literature. There is precedent for it in manuscript. There's a very good article by a woman whose name I can't pronounce. I can share it with anyone interested in how the synoptic table first emerges in manuscript tradition as a way of theorizing. And I remind you that the word theorize means to make visual, right? So to make visible the structure of the emotions. So there's a really interesting way that it's precisely that ephemeral thing of the passions and emotions that the Stoics sought to systematize through the use of these tables. So we have this kind, we have that kind, the irascible, we drive ourselves to things, we drive ourselves away from things. So that's an interesting genealogy for this form. If you're asking how I found it through the catalog, through various kinds of cross searches I do. But I think you're asking about how I interpret it or what sense I make out of it. And I'm happy to share. going to be writing about this, publishing more about this. But one of the things that was really striking, and I mentioned its quiddity, was that the sources that it is extracting from for its own benefit, it says, this is over here. Oh gosh, here. A compendious table of the pestilence or plague gathered out of the latest and best approved physicians, Jubertus, Albertus, Saracenus, Mercurialis, calling this a present view in breviary. Some of these are fairly rare or underused, not very often used and cited sources on plague. I had to really dig to find them, and I did. And the tables aren't really used in them. That's one of the interesting conventions. I'm happy to share those sources with you, but let me see what else we say about Ramism. Yeah. So one of the arguments about the use of the tables that I think probably explains its appeal to this writer is as a systematizing device to give the writer, to give the reader a sense of, if not mastery, then some elusive form of control over something that is so fundamentally outside of human control, and to distill that knowledge as something that is handy, and again, theorizable.
So one last question. It's a long question. Dr. Shirlem, this question is from Everett Hamner. And as you know, I'm a scholar of contemporary literature, not early modern literature. So I come to your material as only a semi-informed novice, exposed through long past coursework, but without having caught quite the same pathogen. What struck me while listening, then, is the sheer familiarity of all this, and how the patriarchal, classist responses to outbreak you were detailing in these texts is a structure toward which many in our culture, and certainly our federal policies, are now nostalgically rushing. While I can imagine a lot of ways these texts could therefore yield many prescient warnings about what may result, then do you feel like these texts also point toward key survival tactics and/or strategies for maintaining community across class and other barriers? Is that part of how you read them?
The long section of my presentation where I took us through the necessary directions and with very little commentary, with very little even narrative, I was just reading from it, couldn't help but feel the overwhelming presentness, less today, less this week in terms of plague, and more in terms of I haven't read today's news, but the anticipated or the predicted raids that people are being volunteered or volunteering themselves to participate in to marshal up migrants, the equivalents of rogues, quote unquote, and vagabonds, and other quote unquote wanton people, as if migration is not only a choice, but as one of the texts I read from suggests, a sinful way of life that one ought not to encourage by giving safe harbor or providing alms. So I share a deep sense of, I'm hesitant to use the word despair. I'm not despairing. And I walked back from what sounded potentially like the desperate or the despairing end of my talk with Lady Macbeth, never washing her hands clean of the sins of what I'm suggesting was an ambient conscient burden of conscience of what it meant to pit one's own survival against others. And to hear in her hearing of echo, so maybe this is a kind of a meta way of answering your question, Everett. But I think these texts suggest that listening, that there's a kind of what I call a moral aesthesis of listening, of being audient, of hearing the sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air, and of answering them, even if that answer is to represent their failure to be answered. To be continued, I suppose.
So I hope everyone will join me now in thanking Stephanie Sherlin for a fascinating and wonderful talk. Thank you all for joining us for our Bibliography Week lecture in 2025. And please, engage with NIAM and its collections in whatever way will work for you.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Take care, everyone.
Bye.